All right, so in the last video, we talked a little bit about what exactly Stuart Hall's reception theory is and what it might look like as we ourselves are watching any kind of media. What I want to talk a little bit more about here is how we can use reception theory as a way to talk about text and media, the audience, ideology, and cultural work all in conversation with each other, to add on a bit of extra context to that general overview that you just watched a minute ago. So, to give a quick recap, reception theory generally is the idea that an author will encode meaning and ideology into a text, in our case, a TV show. The audience then decodes that meaning and decides whether or not it fits into their existing ideology or the cultural lens that they are coming from. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one process where the audience immediately accepts the exact message that the author intended to put into the text. It's a bit more of a negotiation, and it's a bit more active on the audience's part than we might be led to believe from the way that we traditionally think about media. What I do want to add to the explanation from the previous video is that the author and the audience don't necessarily just bring their own personal ideology to their reading of the text. They're also influenced both consciously and unconsciously by the ideology surrounding them in the general culture and in the various communities that they belong to. And they can never quite get away from that, whether or not the author intends to have ideology from the general culture bleed over into the text. It's going to, whether the audience is aware of it or not, their broader cultural context and the ideology that comes from that is going to influence the way that they read the text. So when we start to talk about cultural work, if we're looking from a reception theory standpoint, we are really focusing on how is the audience responding to the text and what can that tell us about the cultural work that is happening among that group. Not necessarily the work that the author is trying to do. Reception theory is really going to help us figure out what is happening among the audience. What are they responding to? So Stuart Hall gives us 3 different ways that the audience can respond within reception theory. He says that there is a dominant reading, which basically means that the audience generally just accepts the author's intended message, or they'll accept the more broadly accepted message of the text. There's a group that agrees upon what this means, and they accept that. Usually taking the dominant reading means that it fits within the audience's existing belief system. It's not necessarily challenging any of the beliefs that they currently hold. On the opposite end, we have an oppositional reading, which is when the audience rejects the author's intended message or rejects what is generally the accepted meaning of the text. So in terms of ideology, that is going to conflict with their existing belief system. We're in an oppositional reading directly opposed to the meaning and the message of the text. So a negotiated reading is a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated. It takes a little bit more active analysis and working with the message and pulling it apart. So, in a negotiated reading, the audience might accept parts of the author's intended message or the accepted meaning, but they might reject or question or challenge other parts. They might be looking at it a bit more closely than they might if they were just going to sit back and have a dominant reading, accepting all of the message. It also takes a bit more active work than an oppositional reading, just immediately opposing the entirety of the message. Often, when we are looking at things critically, when we are doing a deeper analysis, we're doing a sort of negotiated reading. That's the sort of reading that you all have been doing throughout the semester in your writing, is really looking closely at the text, figuring out what is the meaning, what is the ideology underneath this, what parts fit with my worldview, what parts do I reject, what meaning can I take from this. In a negotiated reading, that viewer is also going to kind of look underneath how the author is constructing that message to figure out what is the intended message, what is the explicit message, the implicit one, which parts of that will I accept and which parts won't I. So thinking about a negotiated reading, it's coming from a similar word of negotiation. So there is this sort of idea of a back and forth rather than one straightforward direction. So something else that I do want to address here is thinking through how technology has developed since Stuart Hall first proposed this theory. So when Stuart Hall was writing about this in the 70s, in the 80s, the mode that people got their media was a lot more confined to major networks. There were a much smaller number of people writing that media. Those who were able to get their voices onto major network TV largely reflected the dominant culture. It was vast majority white, heterosexual men. There was a much more kind of narrow, so often what made it into the media was reflective of the dominant culture of the time, reflective of the groups that held the most power in society. However, now, as we have a lot more ways of creating media and distributing it outside of these major platforms with all of their powerful gatekeepers, and there is a lot more way for audiences to respond publicly online. The dominant reading and the dominant culture don't necessarily line up, especially in media like that you were watching for this week. We have a person who belongs to a minority within the culture from the LGBT community. And we also have someone who is a minority within her own field of stand-up comedy, with Hannah Gadsby being a woman and a gay woman in that field. So she's not necessarily representative of the dominant culture, but a dominant reading of her message might be one that conflicts with the dominant culture. So the overall point is that a dominant reading is looking at the author's intended message. Dominant culture is looking more broadly at who is in power within a particular culture. So how we can tie this into cultural work is when we look at how audiences respond to the media that they are watching. This week, we're going to be doing that, looking at social media and audience reviews of Hannah Gadsby's special. This is where we can kind of see cultural work happening. First, we can take a look at what the text relationship is in the first place to the dominant culture, thinking about who is delivering this message and what are they saying about the culture that they're responding to. Once we've got that figured out, we can take a look at what audiences are specifically saying. You can look at the numbers, how much of the audience seems to take a dominant reading, seems to agree with or accept the message that the author, performer in this case, is delivering. What percentage of the audience seems to be opposed to it, to take an oppositional reading, to take issue with the things being said. Are there negotiated readings that seem to be happening? And in those places, it's not necessarily so much, do the audiences only accept the message or reject the message? We want to look at specifically, what are they responding to? What seems to be resonating with them about that message? Is it the message as a whole? Are they pulling out specific parts of it? What are they talking about when you see them giving that dominant or oppositional reading? And in there, what ideologies do you see coming out? What are those kind of ideas? What values? What beliefs, either stated implicitly or explicitly, are we seeing coming out in those conversations about this particular piece of media? Bringing that back to cultural work, this reception theory can help us kind of answer that question of, does the show seem to be encouraging audiences to reinforce their current ways of thinking and acting and feeling, or to practice new ways to think or act or feel in our shared cultural context? And that might be a different answer for different parts of the audience, depending if they are taking that dominant or oppositional or negotiated reading. So among the folks who are having a dominant reading, is this encouraging them to kind of accept how things are within the status quo and our current cultural norms? Or is this asking or allowing them to think of new ways of thinking about the world, or how things could be, for those opposing or rejecting the message, taking that oppositional reading? What are they reacting to exactly? Does it seem like, are they rejecting an invitation to think or feel or act differently? Are they rejecting the way that things currently are and the status quo?